This is Writer's Mosaic in Conversation. Jonny Wright talks to Aniefiok Ekpoudom about his book, Where We Come From, Rap, Home and Hope in Modern Britain.
Jonny Wright here with Writer's Mosaic with Aniefiok Ekpoudom, who has written the amazing book, Where We Come From. So, Aniefiok, do you want to tell the listeners about the book?
Yeah, definitely.
Give you an elevator pitch.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.
So Where We Come From, Rap, Home and Hope in Modern Britain is a social history of British rap and grime, stretching back from the 60s to present day. It's set in three places: South London, the West Midlands and South Wales, and essentially looks at the stories of about 9 or 10 individuals in these regions and uses their life stories and the stories of their involvement with music to tell a wider story and paint a wider portrait of the rise, the boom and then the eventual explosion of British rap and grime. So it takes us back from sound system culture right through to present day, and in some cases, like in South Wales, goes back even further than that, but I guess that was the aim, was to tell the history of the communities that shape the music and not just the music itself.
And we are right now living in the midst of the explosion.
Yeah.
And so how did you pick the three places that you picked? Because I have to say, being from Yorkshire, being the Yorkshire rapper I used to go by, you didn't pick my hometown of Halifax or Huddersfield. But on a serious note, how did you narrow it down to these three places?
Interesting. Yeah, no, good to hear the Yorkshire connection. So I picked the three places. It was, initially, I knew I wanted to write a book that I felt like would talk about individuals' lives in these places, the musicians, the DJs, the community workers who had shaped the music. But I knew I wanted to write about that on a national scale, and a big ambition of the book was to kind of capture a portrait of modern Britain at the same time. And that made me cast my net out wide quite immediately. So I knew I was going to write somewhere about London, and I chose South London mainly because I feel like there have been 3 or 4 like really good books on covering grime specifically, and they were all East London based, and so I feel like I didn't have anything new to add to the conversation there. So I wanted to speak about a different part of the city, South London, and it's a place I know well.
Well, we're in South London right now.
South London now, yeah, exactly, yeah. So I feel like the music and the history of the music in South London is so rich from, as I was saying, like sound system days, from Smiley Culture right through to So Solid Crew, Cookie Crew, through to the likes of Dave and Stormzy now. So I wanted to draw a line that connected those different sounds and generations and decades together. And then moving to the West Midlands after that was probably out of seeing and knowing, having in my career as a music journalist, having made quite a few friends in the West Midlands who make music, who had made music, who are pivotal figures in that scene and industry. I guess just learning that the history of the music there is just as long and as rich as London in that sense. And I think sometimes that's obscured out of the story when we talk about these genres. We think maybe London was the starting place and everywhere else came a decade later, whereas actually they kind of run parallel in a lot of ways. So that was the idea of the West Midlands. And then South Wales was, I knew I wanted to write about Britain, so I knew I had to leave England essentially. And Wales,
I went across rather than up.
Yeah, I went across. I tried going up. But then I found like just these incredible stories in South Wales of some of the musicians and the bands that were there who were making music but blending it with other forms of music, and found like a real rich history of Black British community there too. So it became like a really integral part of the book as well.
And it would. I like the way you talked about. I don't know if you can remember, but you talked about the different versions of Wales in Wales, like the English Wales, the Welsh Wales.
Yeah.
I thought that from a kind of talking about rap and identity, which this book does a lot. That was a really interesting thing that I've been to Wales a few times, but I'm just like, oh, it's Wales, isn't it? But I'm like, oh, the Welsh are all kind of like pretty anti-English, like, and I've always been down with them for that. But it's not as simple, it's not as binary as that. Like, and you really like point that out in the book.
Yeah, no, that was so interesting. So as you say, I think it was a sociologist, Dennis Balsam, who I guess has this defining theory of like Welsh identity called the 3 Wales model essentially, and kind of describes Wales, especially in like a contemporary sense anyway, as There's Welsh Wales, which is like the northern part of Wales, which is, I guess, the Wales that figure in a lot of people's imagination, like green, rural fields, like large farmlands, mountains. North Wales, essentially, and people speak Welsh there, and they have a real strong sense of Welsh identity. Then there was like the industrial Wales, which was like the South Wales valleys and the valley towns where, I guess, famed for mining, but then had suffered under deindustrialisation, who couldn't speak Welsh but still felt very Welsh at heart. And then there was what he called English Wales, which is like the border towns that kind of go from, I think, Monmouthshire down to like Cardiff, and those are the places that the English border is. They're closer to the English border than they are to North Wales and stuff like that. And they, I guess, his idea is that they were more British in their sense of identity, couldn't speak Welsh really, only spoke English, and he'd kind of carved the country up along those three like geographical regions. And then a lot of the musicians I was speaking to were based in Cardiff and Newport, so their life stories definitely bore out that theory in a lot of ways, even though they were proud to be Welsh in a rap sense because that was quite unique, but definitely wouldn't go to North Wales, hadn't been there really, were connected maybe to more what was going on in Bristol and the Bristol music scene and stuff like that. So it was really interesting. I feel like it took a lot of studying to learn about Wales because I was so foreign to the country. I didn't have all of this ingrained knowledge, so I had to really do my digging and I spoke to a lot of university professors about just trying to have them explain to me what is the reality of Wales, like how did it get to this point. So that was quite interesting.
And what I thought was great about the places you picked as well is, like, for example, between the Welsh kind of case studies and the Midlands and London as well, there's a lot of similarities there's a lot of differences obviously, which makes it super interesting, but then, you know, looking at how the industry closed down in Wales was the same as like what happened in the Midlands. It's just different. I felt like a lot of the rappers you studied became rappers because they were unhappy, and I found that like super interesting.
As you say, we're living in the midst of these genres being huge, and that's quite visible to see, like people performing festivals, magazine covers, all of this stuff. But I was really interested in taking that back a second, looking at like how does the music impact people's, and what does it mean to people on an everyday kind of casual sense. And there are a lot of those stories where that people who were either unhappy in their lives or were searching for some kind of meaning or connection or purpose or community were able to find that through participating and through making the genres. And as you say, a lot of them really unhappy too, growing up in spaces where the industrialisation, economic upheaval, social upheaval had kind of torn through a lot of these different communities, and these were the generations who were growing up in the aftermath of that, essentially trying to figure out their lives and what they want to do going forward with that. And you see that in Wales, you see that in the stories in the West Midlands, you see that in the stories in South London too.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, so what made you take you back to quote Nas, to Genesis, to the beginning? What made you want to do the book?
Yeah, I'd wanted to write a book for a long time. So I've been a music journalist. I'd been working in music journalism for maybe 7-8 years before that, and had been writing exclusively about Black British music essentially. I always thought there was a really interesting story there about where the music comes from, and also showcasing that this eruption wasn't necessarily an accident, that there's been generations and generations of people making music, building communities, building structures, sacrificing themselves for these sounds. And also I think just to archive a lot of these stories, I saw the book as kind of a documentation and filling out of that wider context. And
I think you absolutely do, and what's great is reading the book, like you join the dots, so it's kind of like, you know, Raga to Jungle to like to Gap, and you connect all the dots. How aware do you think they are of the bigger context of like actually what inspired gigs, like how of the steps before?
Yeah, I don't think a lot of them are that aware, to be fair, which I understand. I feel like writing music, and rap specifically, is definitely a very different art form to literature. Obviously they're both writing, so they share those similarities, but rap is such an immediate art form. Like people are really talking about, especially when you're young and the musicians are young, they're talking about what they literally see when they open their eyes. What is it that they see, and then they're putting that directly onto the page, which is like the beauty of it, which why you get so much emotion in it. But that doesn't necessarily lend itself to like a lot of reflection on like the histories that have come before them in that sense. And so I think it's no coincidence that a lot of these genres, as you mentioned, like Raga, Jungle, Garage, Grime, Funky House, like they all carry different names. And if you ask people at the time when they were teenagers making these genres, if they thought the genre was the same or connected to ragga. If you ask the grime MC, they might say yes, some of them might say no, but I think there wouldn't be the full understanding of like the cultural and historical influences and how even like the roads people are walking on have been shot in other music videos previously. That was something that I definitely came up in, say, a place like Coventry. There's a certain road in a place called Hillfields which has appeared in about 5 or 6 different music videos
and the Gambian MC, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And that was like a modern take on it, and then you can find videos of that same road in like boom bap, hip hop, in sound systems, in carnivals, all the way back to like two-tone. So that connection I don't think was made, which is what I was interested in fleshing out.
Yeah, and well, I guess it's your job as a writer to zoom out, and
exactly.
It's the rapper's job to just like open the eyes and rap. I really like the language you use. For example, he said they have packed old lives and far countries into small suitcases, gambling on their futures, waiting on the hope of what Britain could be. How much of a commonality did you kind of see in that with the rappers who you were interviewing?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think thank you for reading out that quote. I feel like immigration kind of underpins these genres like hugely. I feel like that's kind of the bedrock of them. I kind of see the even from listening to the music, you can hear like the different waves of like black migration into the UK, from like the Windrush generation, which that passage was about, and I guess the arrival of Caribbean people in the UK. Then you have like the arrival of like West African and East African people in the like 80s, and then I guess a big wave of like Somali immigration after. And when you look at the landscape of British rap, people's backgrounds tend to reflect those. Probably like 90% of rappers in the UK probably reflect those backgrounds to some extent. So I think it was really important to include, because that then influences even like the language people use, the musical selections people use, the influences that they have. I think that's really present in the music, and also I guess like the sound system element to it as well, which is maybe slightly different to the US, and I think where probably the UK has diverged from the US in a certain way is those like influences that have come from overseas have really shaped the genres, and of course like the musicians are a product of those genres too. And I think you end up in places like, I think I talk about in South London, where you have like crews of teenagers but from all different heritages, some from Ghana, some from Jamaica, some from Trinidad, some from Nigeria, but they're all together having grown up in South London and have kind of like blended these different backgrounds into these new styles of music, which I think is quite a distinctly British thing in terms of how they sound now.
Do you think, and I've just thought of this now, but do you think that because I'm comparing Britain to America now, do you think that because America, the dominant black population in America has been more static, in that it's been African American, there's been people who can't trace their ancestry back to a specific country of origin, and obviously you've had, Biggie's mum was Jamaican, Cool Herc started it all off, was from Jamaica, the sound system cultures are obviously, and there are lots of black people emigrating to America now, so obviously, and you have rappers like Chidena and stuff like that, but in the main, most kind of like, I'd say, maybe 80% of rappers in America are African American of unknown countries. Whereas in the UK, like, people tend to know where their forefathers are from. And actually, we've seen a shift from when I was growing up, when most black people here are from the Caribbean, and now it's most black people are from different countries in Africa. So do you think that has made the music kind of more vibrant and more changeable and malleable?
Yeah, I would say, I think definitely it means, I think the music just has so many, like a range of influences, but that means it can bring in music from all across the world in that sense. The cultural routines are still the same, so you're supposed to speak in quite similar on a song. And the same way with African artists, like it feels quite normal when somebody like J Hus sits alongside on a song with Burna Boy, if that makes sense. And again, the language can be understood. The language from there has influenced the language here. UK rap can speak in a way that maybe a lot of other countries' versions of rap can't speak. And because, of course, the influence of America is so huge, naturally we've all grown up listening to American artists, so we have an understanding of that too. So I feel like it's such an interesting meeting pot for the diaspora in that way.
Do you think it's becoming more different or more the same? Almost like racially ambiguous about like a kind of like Pot of Paper or Central C, and who are kind of sounding similar to Dave, and it's like it's just a London experience or it's a Midlands experience, and it's kind of they're all in this melting pot together? Or do you think actually no, like it's people are being very specific, and actually this guy's from Gambia, this guy's from Nigeria, and they're really bringing that to the table? Or do you think it's
I think it's a bit of both. I think definitely as rap has grown, it's come to be like, I guess one of the almost like the dominant forms of expression in all places across the UK, like towns and cities, amongst young people anyway, which is what I find really interesting. It's like one of the most listened to genres, and probably for like a younger generation, probably the most listened to genre in that sense, which I find really interesting. But I think with that, it means that you just get an array of stories arriving with that too. And as you say, somebody like Pot Paper, who's from East London, naturally has grown up with the music and then naturally uses that as his tool of expression as well. So it's telling like I feel like you're having artists tell very specific stories to where they're from geographically, whether that's London, whether that's East London, whether that's Tottenham, whether that's South London, whether that's Birmingham, whether that's Manchester. And then I think in their music...
Whether that's Yorkshire.
Whether that's Yorkshire, yeah. And then I think in their music, almost like subconsciously carrying their influences with them.
Another quote I wanted to pull out is, when you were born in the ashes of this place, you were taught to fight and never show weakness, taught to conceal the flutters in your stomach with a mask. But then the mask eats the face and you become something you're not. What do you think about that in relation to rap in general?
Interesting. So yeah, that quote, and it's about a guy called Despa who is from Walsall and moves to Birmingham, but it's about him growing up in a small town in Walsall, and I guess growing up around a lot of violence at a certain age and adapting to his surroundings, and by adapting to his surroundings slowly losing almost the childlike innocence that he had at a certain stage. And I think was really showing like how an environment I guess wears on a person and eventually can craft who they become and how they behave. And when you do repeat certain actions for so long, that essentially becomes who you are, which I thought was really, and a lot of that quote comes from him. He was kind of telling me this, and I think the idea of the mask eats the face, I think that extends beyond rap. I think it's just us as individuals, ourselves. I think it's present in rap in that people are presenting a character, but I think it's more indicative of young people growing up in certain communities, or not even certain communities, growing up with certain experiences and being changed by them. That's was, as I said, a lot of violence, a lot of grief, but also then how people then channel those emotions into making music. It was from a famous Tiger Woods profile, that he did, and how Tiger Woods had essentially changed as a person after his dad passed away, and eventually this like sweet kid that he was changed by this huge fame and success that he experienced, and the mask that he was wearing and projecting out into the world eventually eroded his sense of self and became indistinguishable in that sense. So I find that as a concept probably more interesting, and I think it relates to rap, but I think it can speak to so many things more broadly in that sense.
How much of a pressure do you think there is on rappers to have this kind of road persona?
I think rap does reflect like a lot of those, especially at a certain age. I think some of the things you hear in rap only just reflect what like young masculinity is like at a certain time period and in a certain stage of your life, and not everyone's isn't about a clash, but you can still kind of understand that in relation to whatever other experiences we've all had in our own lives. So I think there was definitely a masculinity element, especially with music that's made and created by people who are in their teens, 14, 15, 16, 17, like grime was. I think it was so interesting how that would always spill over into the music.
I found Cadet a really interesting case study because of the vulnerability he had. Yeah, what do you think just in general about this concept of vulnerability in rap, and how vulnerable should you be?
Yeah, Cadet was a late rapper from Clapham/Croydon, and he's one of the main stories that really lead the book, especially in the South London section. And his music, even I listened to a lot of his music growing up and still listen to a lot of his music now, and very vulnerable in terms of, but like kind of like a radical vulnerability he would have in his music, where
you said he used to like end phone calls with "I love you," right, to the man.
Yeah. So yeah, like quite definitely like almost a bit of a unicorn for like a guy his age. And then yeah, this like radical sense of vulnerability in his music. He'd talk about therapy sessions with his dad, trying to repair his relationship with his dad, who had been absent at a point. He'd talk about feeling like a disappointment to his mum in some of his songs. He'd talk about jealousy and envy of his cousin Krept, who is a very famous rapper as well. And it kind of would speak about the things that almost people tend to keep hidden beneath the surface in that sense, but it would really be unashamed in saying like, this is who I am and this is how I see the world. And so I was really keen on telling his story because I feel like his music had made such an impact on so many people in such a way, but I think his story also really like reflected the history of the music and the history of the migration and community. Like his grandparents had come from Jamaica, his parents were born here, his best friends were Ghanaian. He started making grime in school, and then when he passed away, like he was really celebrated by like South London as a community. So I feel like all of what I was trying to speak to in the book was kind of encapsulated in his story, and I think his music's such a testament to that vulnerability, but then also how you kind of leave an archive and a record of your thoughts behind when you go in music. Like you can dial back into some of his songs and figure out exactly what he was thinking at a certain period in his life, and done with that sense of transparency, which you don't really get in music at all, really. He was quite rare in that sense. I think it leaves behind something quite powerful.
Was there any bitterness in some of the older generation feeling that they came through at the wrong time, feeling that, if only we'd been coming through now, we'd be made?
Yeah, I didn't encounter it, but I have heard that before. But I didn't encounter it. I think the most interesting thing I encountered, and some of the stories I found the most interesting and still find the most interesting, is those who came through in slightly older generations, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, realised that they were just comparing like the trajectory of the music to a place like America, realising they were a few generations too soon to make a viable living out of it, but then stuck with it anyway, and then were able to reap those rewards like 2 decades down the line. That sense of like persistence I still find mind-blowing. I think Giggs is a really good example of that, of making music starting in the early 2000s when that wasn't really a viable career, and persisting with it and having the faith and I guess the dream that this music one day will turn into something legitimate, and following that down the line for 2 decades. I think there's so many stories of artists who could have quit, and a lot of their contemporaries did quit. Those who grew up in like the early millennium, a lot of them did quit, but those who kind of stuck it out, I have like a real fondness and appreciation of, because that's definitely not easy. It took me 5 years to write a book. I can't imagine like doing a career for 20 years and then with the faith that it might turn into something.
Black British music is spreading, and do you think that's going to continue to happen?
I think it's been really interesting to see that spread and see how Black British music has spread globally, and I think has spread a different sense of identity with it too. It's a different sense of British identity too anyway. I think when you think about a lot of the idea of British identity that existed overseas was usually carried by like shows like Downton Abbey or like the royal family, or these very like traditional forms of like British disposition. Like it was speaking in a very specific way, like quite a posh accent and whatnot. And I think it's been so interesting seeing like how the music has just spread a completely different idea of Britain around the world, as well as shows like Top Boy and whatnot, but and Chewing Gum and stuff like that, showcasing a different side of British identity in that sense, and a Black British identity too. I think it's been really powerful. If you go to, I don't know, like New Zealand or Australia, and you see the drill and the forms of rap that they're making, they've essentially taken huge influence from how people in the UK speak, how people in the UK dress, the productions.
Do rappers who are not black have a kind of extra responsibility to kind of pay respects and not culture appropriate, or is it just now out in the open that anyone can rap and that's it?
The beautiful thing about it is that anyone can participate. Like, you don't need really expensive equipment, you don't need instruments. You can just tell your story on an instrumental essentially, and I think that is what has been really liberating about it, and is what I found really liberating about a lot of the stories of the books. I feel like that element means that you're naturally going to have participants from all walks of life, because there's a class element to it as well, right? So I feel like that isn't. I enjoy listening to that. I enjoy listening to how people experience the world through this genre. One of the chaps I go to the South Wales Valleys, which is like 95% white Welsh working class town, but there are people making music there about growing up under the haze of like the steel mines and stuff like that, and the steel factories. So I find that really interesting to listen to.
Or a theme that comes up repeatedly was about making money for their children and how having children would change a kind of rapper's outlook. Can you give us any insight into that?
Yeah, so a lot of the men in the book anyway become fathers. As we see them become fathers, and it kind of traces their experiences of early fatherhood in that way, and you kind of see how the idea of becoming a parent like really shifts who they are internally, and I guess makes them think about their lives and reflect on their lives in a different way. It makes them reflect on like essentially like their purpose as human beings in a very different way. You see people then think of wanting to build legacies for their children, or even just have a sense of, I guess, even finances that they can pass down to their daughters and to their sons in that sense. And because rappers, I guess what they've chosen to spend their lives doing, even if either they're working behind the scenes in the industry of it, or they are musicians themselves, that then the music takes on a different pressure where they feel like they not only have to make it for themselves and to lift themselves out of whatever situation they find themselves in, but then to also ensure that they can provide for their children.
What everyday insight did you get into what life is really like for these people?
Yeah, that was like a lot of the heartbeat of the book, and a lot of what I was trying to hear about and then essentially put on the page, because most rappers aren't millionaires. That's the reality of it. There's like a crop of those at the very, very, I guess, highest levels of that who have done really well, and are like multi-millionaires in many cases, but there are a huge majority who don't live like that, or who haven't lived like that, but have gone on these tours, toured across the UK, toured across Europe, have been recording music, putting out albums and whatnot. Even if they're signed like that, they're still going through those experiences. So yeah, it was a pulling back on the curtain in that sense, in showcasing that, kind of showcasing, I guess, like the transparency that comes with those tours. So in the Welsh group Asteroid Boys, they are doing really well. They like play Glastonbury, they play all across Europe. But one of the members, Del, he was, I think, 15 at the time. He was the producer, so he's 15 at the time. So he's still in school doing his GCSEs when they're touring across the world. So across the UK. So there'd be a show in Leeds or Norwich or Glastonbury, and then on the weekend, then in the Monday morning, he's back in his geography class. Yeah, I think it was important to show the reality of what that is, and to show how people cope and don't cope with that.
What were your highlights of people you interviewed?
One thing I loved about doing the book was, I guess, journalism is quite restricted at this time period, because you maybe only have like 45 minutes with someone, an hour with someone when you're doing a profile and whatnot. Whereas this, I could just spend like 8 hours with someone, 9 hours with someone, and really just sit with them for an entire day, which was what I probably enjoyed the most about it. So collecting those stories, I think, was probably like the most enjoyable part of it. Writing the book was fun as well, but that was definitely the most enjoyable part of it. In terms of like memorable interviews, a guy called Cecil Morris in Birmingham, who was started one of the first Black Pirate radio stations in Birmingham. He had like an incredible story about setting up his station, PCRL, over 1,000 times, I think, after being pulled down by the authorities and whatnot. That was like a really beautiful interview, and also really beautiful to sit with elders from that generation, especially as like coming from a West African background. I don't have any grandparents or parents who were born and raised in the UK, so like hearing their experiences of what Britain was like in like the 70s and the 60s and the 80s was like really, really eye-opening and really special in that sense.
Are we losing the consciousness in rap?
I wouldn't say so. I do think that even in the UK, I feel like a lot of, probably the biggest rapper in the UK, maybe Dave, probably is still quite conscious of his music. And I think the music is so broad now, there are so many people that make it, that there are those pockets of people who do make that more conscious music still, and are really popular, like Lil Kana, like Little Sims. Like, these are huge musicians who are selling out huge arenas with their tours and with their shows and whatnot. And then I think otherwise, I do think like, if we then have to look at, I guess, like the society that we're living in and the kind of individuals that are being, who are emerging out of society, I feel like if we want more conscious rap, we have to more look at, are we in a community, in a society that's producing more conscious individuals, and if not, then why not, if that makes sense. It kind of reminds me when people talk about racism in football grounds. They're like, oh, we need to stop the racism in football grounds. But it's like, yeah, that's true, but let's look at why the society we're living in is continually producing people who are being overtly racist. Like, what's happening there?
What personality traits make a great rapper?
And I definitely think like drive, and I think hunger is something, and like kind of like just wide-eyed ambition is something I saw a lot when interviewing a lot of people. And curiosity, I think, is a big thing too. Like that, it underpins creativity, right? Is like exploring, going left when everything is telling you go right. Like exploring different avenues of your mind and your sense of self in that way. And I think the greatest rappers have that, but then I think they also have a sense of drive and a sense of persistence. Is that feeling that you can overcome, I guess, your current circumstances.
Absolutely. And did you ever want to be a rapper?
Well, I've never wanted to rap. I've always just more liked writing in that sense. So
finally, what makes, for Writer's Mosaic now, what makes a great writer in rap?
I do think that is then probably where it's most similar to literature in that sense, where a lot of it is instinct, right? Like how you choose to express yourself and your, I guess, specific cadence and your specific rhythm and your specific style. A lot of that is just an accumulation of like the different influences you've taken in over the years, but I think a lot of it is expressed instinctively. So I think it's like not ignoring that instinct, but almost going with it, and then continuing to tap into like that, I guess, sense of style that makes you unique in that sense. And that's what, speaking from my perspective anyway, that's like what a lot of my favourite writers across the board do, whether they're rappers, whether they're poets, whether they're novelists. It's like they all write with a specific style, and even if they aren't imposed in the stories, you can tell it's them by the way they pronounce their words or the way they write a certain sentence and whatnot. So I feel like the grounding to writing are probably quite similar in that sense. And then again, yeah, I think vulnerability, honesty and a sense of relatability, but also a vividness is what I always look for in writing, and that's why a lot of my favourite rappers and my favourite authors have that in common. Like they all write with a real sense of vividness, I would say.
Well, you have become one of my favourite authors, bro. So I love this book. Thanks for thanks for sharing, thanks for talking. And yeah, please, people, check out Where We Come From. It's an amazing book. Well, I'll give the full title: Where We Come From, Rap, Home and Hope in Modern Britain. So yeah, I've got hope in modern Britain if it's like this, bro. So thank you.
No, thanks, man. I appreciate it.
Jonny Wright was talking to Aniefiok Ekpoudom. To hear more writers, go to writersmosaic.org.uk.